beyond visual line of sight, I'm sure you've been to maybe some sessions that talked about Part 108. You've heard this, discussed. But man, there's a lot more to beyond visual line of sight operations than just the draft Part 108 rule. We're going to talk about spectrum today. We're going to talk about UAS traffic management. A little bit later, we're going to talk about counter UAS, which is the yin to drones yang, because you can't do beyond visual line of sight operations if you don't know what's out there and you can't see it in some format. All right, settling in. I wish I had the roaring fire behind them. So now that the production set is ready, we'll go ahead and begin Drone Pathways in the Sky, Global UTM, and Beyond Visual Line of Sight integration. Without further ado, Mary Caitlin Ray, our fearless, I don't want to even call you a moderator now, our fearless facilitator.
Yes.
Thank
Fireside chatty.
There you go.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. I'm Mary Caitlin Ray. I'm a partner at Kroll and Mooring's transportation practice based in our DC office, where we focus on all things related to drones and manned aircraft on the transactional and the regulatory side. So very happy to be here for, I think, maybe our seventh Law Tech Connect? Fifth? Okay. Fifth Law Tech Connect. And just really, really happy to be supporting this group and this event. It's really important to us. So without further ado, we've pivoted to a fireside chat format today. So we'll get to have a really in-depth conversation about BVLOS, UTM, FCC, and whatever else is on everyone's mind this morning. So I will let our other fireside chatties introduce themselves.
Morning, everyone. Matthew Satterley. I'm Senior Director at Greenberg Traurig, working on transportation practice. I'd spent about a decade in the private sector with different drone companies, and I've been with Greenberg. This is my third week, so so excited to dive in.
Great. And hi, everybody. Jennifer Richter from Aiken Gump. I lead the telecom, media, and technology practice there. That includes our advanced aviation work. We've been at this for about a dozen years. I think I spoke at the very first NASA UTM conference that ever was, and really, worked with the industry pioneers on how we are conceiving these UTM systems. I think I said at that very first conference that I was afraid that the FCC and spectrum issues were going to become a long pole in the tent and was really going to delay the deployment of meaningful UTM. I think that was right. Anyway. But now there are lots of other FCC issues, and I think everybody here has been talking about the covered list and the impacts on the industry, so looking forward to talking about that today, too, now that we have a little more time.
Well, let's jump right in on that topic then, Jennifer, and tell us, why does the FCC control what drones can enter the market? Why are we talking about the FCC at all here?
Yeah, it's a little bit of the tail wagging the dog, right? And that's how it feels. But of course, the requirement to get FCC equipment authorizations always was there. It was a sort of a last regulatory check. If you are operating a device that either intentionally or unintentionally emits radio frequency, you need an FCC equipment authorization. But I think what our government found when they were trying to lock down the supply chain to principally Chinese technology, that's not where we are today, of course, but when this all started with concerns about China and the supply chain for communications devices, Congress and the administration and the FCC realized that equipment authorizations was like an amazing tool they could use to vet and slow down some of the impact of Chinese technology. That has now been really supercharged with the announcement on December 22nd that all foreign UAS and UAS components are now on the covered list. And that's the big shift, because it used to be that it was just companies with respect to certain technology that were on the covered list. And everyone anticipated when the December 22nd announcement was made that DJI and Autel would be placed on the covered list along with Huawei, ZTE, and other companies. They did that, but then they also added to the covered list all major foreign UAS components, which includes obviously all the things that communicate, but it also includes things like batteries and motors. Why does the FCC have authorization over batteries and motors? Everyone was calling us and asking us about. They don't from the standpoint of giving you an equipment authorization for that, but now because it's on the covered list, you've got to find a way to get off the covered list if you're using foreign UAS components. And so the list of things that's on the covered list now includes data transmission devices, communication systems, and flight controllers. That was probably not a surprise to anybody. Ground control stations, UAS controllers, navigation systems, sensors and cameras, and then the batteries and battery management systems and the motors. So there's so much to know about it, and there are 3 ways to get off the covered list. One is if you satisfy Blue UAS. Another is if you can satisfy Buy American, which is like a 65% standard, the cost of all your components on the bottom and the cost of your U.S. components on the top. We don't know any companies that are U.S. companies that are able to satisfy that today. So while we think about this as the foreign UAS and UAS components, it really is impacting domestic UAS manufacturers. This is what we're finding because most of the cost of their components is coming from foreign components. So batteries and motors are typically not made here, and that's a really big issue. So everyone has to figure out a way to satisfy that 65%, or you get a conditional approval, and there's a whole process to go through for that. I think one of our clients is going to get off the covered list tomorrow. We're submitting a lot of these conditional approval applications. It's not terribly difficult, but the main focus of it is your onshoring plan. So how are you going to, if you're not today sourcing your major UAS components from the United States, how are you going to do that moving ahead? How are you going to manufacture these things, maybe yourself, in order to satisfy that standard? So these are the puzzles we're trying to figure out. And this is really what the White House wants. They want to know what are the major components in your UAS and where are you getting them from? And they are really asking for all of this information as part of your conditional approval because they're gathering that information to understand where they might need to invest as our government to help to boost domestic manufacturing of these components. So that was a lot. That was a long filibuster, but I think that's if you're not working with counsel that really understands what's happening, whether you're a foreign UAS manufacturer or domestic, you really do need to get with somebody that understands it well. And we are in meetings with the FCC and the White House every week on these issues and working with them actively, also to try to find some supports for U.S. manufacturers of this technology.
So I think that was really well said, Jennifer. I know this has been really dynamic, right? So the initial public notice was December 22nd, as you noted, but there have been several updates. I know my partner, Joel Roberson, and I went in to speak to the National Security Council, and some of the elements that came out on December 22nd were even a surprise to them. I think it was changing to include all foreign nations right up until the last minute. But they've had subsequent releases and updates about software and firmware updates and the exceptions that you mentioned, Blue UAS and Buy America. It might be really interesting for people to hear about like how your council is changing week by week and how you position them to be able to respond to that.
And maybe one thing also just to note for you all is the dynamics around the change were really interesting. So as I said, we were all anticipating that DJI and Autel were going to be added to the covered list. But then when it came out and it was all foreign UAS and UAS components, it really did catch everybody by surprise on the Hill, in the agencies. And so what was the reason for the change? It actually had a lot to do with the trade negotiations that are ongoing, including today, between the US and China. And I think China was feeling very sensitive about the fact that it was only their drones that were ending up on the covered list, and this was a kind of a fig leaf to them that the administration decided to put all foreign UAS on the covered list. That, of course, I think the impact of that to domestic companies was maybe not fully understood or thought through at that time, and that's really where a lot of the upset came from. Then to talk about the Buy American standards. So, and this is something that I think has been changing and may continue to change, in part because we're working on some changes related to software credits, which you might be able to do anyway if you read the regulation really carefully, but we're trying to get some official authorization about it. The statute that they cite, this is really important for the lawyers in the room, important for the business people. The statute that they cite for Buy American and the 65%, if you study that Buy American standard, there are all kinds of exemptions that are part of that. And if you're somebody who really works in government contracting and understands that regulation, you might say, oh, hey, there's an exemption for non-availability. So if I can't get batteries and motors made in the United States, I can get them from other countries, and then I can disregard that cost, right? That's kind of the way it works in the real world, not FCC world. Same with equipment from WTO countries. There's an exemption for that. So that equipment can count the same as U.S. equipment. Those would be great if you could use them. But when we started talking with the FCC and the White House about it, they said, absolutely not. And the reason is that they want these things manufactured in the United States, and they don't want to give us an out for things that aren't made here now. So very important to understand that you can't just look at the statute. You should be able to, but you can't. Use all of the parts of the statute that they cite. So, I mean, again, there's just so much to know about it.
So I think I'm hearing three main things from you two on this topic. One is that this doesn't apply to just radios, right? Even though it's much broader than that. So if you are, thinking FCC, telecom, it must apply to, radio transmission equipment, wrong. It's broader than that. Two, it seems like, we sort of have this Buy America framework that, folks in the public procurement space are very familiar with. But now we've got a situation where the left hand's not talking to the right hand, and the exemptions that, folks have gotten used to relying upon in this space are not holding on the FCC side. So they've kind of become a little bit, what I'm hearing, like useless in that regard. And then third is that you should definitely call counsel if you have issues related to FCC equipment authorizations for UAS.
One of the common fact patterns that people come to us with are, so I've got my communications device that I use in my UAS. It already has equipment authorization. Why can't I keep using that? So I want to take that communications device and I want to put it in a new set of equipment to make kind of a new or different or modified or upgraded UAS. Isn't that okay? Why do I have to go back to the FCC? And the answer is, you wouldn't necessarily have to go back to the FCC if you can satisfy Buy American with all of your parts and you can certify that. But chances are your equipment includes batteries and motors from foreign countries. So it's on the covered list, right? So the stuff that you've been using that you didn't have to get any kind of specific clearance for, now you likely have to. And this is where working with, your counsel is going to be really helpful.
Well, I want to ask you both before we sort of officially pivot into the UTM space. What does this have to do with UTM?
Yeah, I think it's really important to set the scene because this really impacts scalability. So, as you walk around the conference and you're here at Law Tech Connect, everybody's talking about BVLOS. We talk about UTM, and in order for companies to be successful, they need scalability. But if they don't have aircraft because they can't import the parts or they can't import the drone itself, then they're not going to be able to achieve it. So for our firm, some of our clients are some of the biggest flyers in the United States right now. We have a manufacturer who has 1 million flights a year. We have a drone delivery company that's doing 1 million flights a year. But now they're starting to get concerned, are we going to have enough aircraft to meet that demand? And so this is why it's really important to set the stage for UTM, BVLOS with, are we going to actually be able to do it even if the regulation is now unlocked?
That makes great sense and is a really good segue into the UTM conversation, I think. So, Matt, I'd like to ask you, for folks who kind of think of UTM as just a software solution, how do you think of UTM, and how would you describe it sort of in the context of a system of systems? How is it actually going to work?
Yeah, so I think most people understand UTM as a suite of safety services that are allowing the operator to mitigate against certain air risk or ground risk. A lot of those services have typically been understood in the earlier years more as supplementary data services, so terrain, obstacle information, weather, LANCE, the low altitude authorization notification capability that provides you airspace access and controlled airspace. Those are more static services. They offer a benefit to a single operator. They kind of live within this relationship between the software provider and the UAS operator. But I think what doesn't get talked enough about when it comes to UTM is the interoperability. I think it is an essential function of UTM, the ability to share data throughout the ecosystem so that they have the strategic awareness to be able to coordinate with other UAS operators, with the conventional aircraft community. That interoperability layer is essential for the future of scalability of drones. And I don't think that's something that people reference enough when we talk about UTM. And that's really what the US has been pioneering over the last couple years. I'm sure we'll get into it more. But the FAA really put itself out there accepting and approving this interoperability model, which is now driving huge amounts of traffic in the Dallas-Fort Worth area where it started, but across the entire country.
And so, Jennifer, Matt used the word interoperability, which I think can be used to describe a lot of, the direction that we want to go in this space. How would you describe what the various U.S. agencies are doing to sort of themselves be more interoperable when it comes to setting up this system?
Such a good question. So maybe that's sort of two layers. So in order to have a truly functioning, networked UTM system that's interoperable, of course you have to have communications assets that support that. And how are we going to communicate with our UAS? How are they going to communicate with each other? How are they going to communicate with the UTM infrastructure and with crewed aviation? These are all really important questions. We have literally been talking about this for a decade, and we still don't have the right answers at our fingertips. Yesterday, somebody on a panel talked about the fact that it's really great that there's more density in 4G and 5G around in some of the areas where people are flying, because people are using commercial wireless assets for communicating with UAS as part of UTM. But that's not actually authorized by the FCC. And in fact, the FCC told Congress a number of years ago that they haven't approved it. And the reason is there's a question about what happens when drones start flying at density. How much will their use of the spectrum at elevation impact the same use of the spectrum on the ground for terrestrial purposes? The FCC hasn't studied it. The rules weren't designed with this in mind, and so that actually needs to happen. Some of it is happening in the standards bodies, which is great. But so that's the commercial wireless side of it. There's also dedicated spectrum for UAS, and I think the intention is to use that, the 5030 to 5091 spectrum, with what they call a dynamic frequency management system, and that can all be part of UTM, and it should be, right? But that is not, those rulemakings aren't concluded either. And in fact, the FCC just released a public notice asking for comment, and we're in the comment period now, about what they can do, what can the FCC do to unleash drone dominance. So in addition to what the FAA is doing to put out these BVLOS rules and try to enable these systems, the FCC actually has so much work to do. in order to really approve the use of suitable spectrum to enable UTM. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm not the FCC expert, but certainly when I was in private industry and working with our clients now, I think their biggest concern is that this continues to be performance-based. So there's a lot of leading questions that the FCC asked about certain allocations of spectrum or certain dedicated spectrum. And I know that for our clients, they've said, listen, our solution today is probably going to be different in 2 years. We're operating on unlicensed spectrum over LTE right now. It satisfies all of our needs, but that could be really different a year from now, 2 years from now. What if we move from cellular to mostly vehicle-to-vehicle over-the-air coordination? What if we're in a denied environment because we're operating in more densely populated areas and we need to have a different communications layer? And so for our clients, it's not so much that we want a clear determination about what frequency band we should be using. It's allow us to continue to iterate and solve for our customers the way we need to.
Yeah, and sorry, I'll just jump in. And that's such a great point. There should be a whole bunch of tools that are approved for use, or at least not prohibited for use, right? And so I've heard a lot of people talking here about using Starlink communications as one of the ways that they're connecting. I think with respect to a UTM system, you probably don't want to have to go all the way to a satellite and back down in order to enable the sharing of information, but many companies are using that as a tool as well, and there are satellite bands that actually are authorized for use for aviation. So there are many tools, unlicensed, licensed, wireless, satellite, and I think we do have to get to a moment where all of these can be used in conjunction as part of an operational system.
And I want to comment too on something that you just said, Matt, which I think is also really relevant in the sort of operating space, so more on like the FAA regulatory side. But that is like the solutions of today are not necessarily the solutions of maybe even 6 months from now, a year from now, 2 years from now, 5 years from now. How do you build a business sort of, with that underlying context? And I think it's not only, of huge importance to, drone manufacturers, drone operators, but also to investors, right? Who, as part of their reasonable diligence want to know, do you have a business plan and, the regulatory sort of compliance plan to back it up that's going to make this a long-term viable business? And I think what we're seeing, at least on the FAA regulatory side, is that, the companies that are most successful in this space are the ones that think about compliance as part of their business strategy as opposed to like a roadblock, right? It's how do we get from A to B, understanding that B might not be what we think it will be, down the road. And it requires a lot of, I think, early engagement and forward thinking. And that holds true on the BVLOS side too. I think with, the Part 108, right? It's how do we manage the current operating environment knowing that, once this final rule is released and it is effective, things are going to look different. So that may be, kind of segue us into the discussion about, I know we unfortunately don't have our USpace EASA panelists today, but one of the things that I am hearing about USpace, right, is that you sort of have layers of a wedding cake, right? You have the overarching EASA, and then, for example, you might have, the Germany and sort of their, framework. And then below that, depending on the country, you might then have state and local considerations that have to be folded in. And so I'm curious, Matt, sort of what your thoughts are on the USpace model, and if you think that that's going to be used as a model for other systems, or if there's, a way that we can sort of compare and contrast to what we're doing in the US.
Yeah, I'll do my best anti-Joanna answer here. So I had the privilege of waking up at 3 a.m. every single day to work on the USpace AMC and GM for a year. It was fabulous fun. But we basically, EASA really took a pretty bold step in trying to create the regulatory framework that the UTM and UAS community have been begging for about a decade. EASA tried to do a comprehensive look about where do we think the UAS industry and AAM industry will be 10 years from now, and we want to give all of these operators the certainty to build a business. It was ambitious, it was well-intentioned. But I think they tried to tackle way too much at once. And so the implementation details and the reality of satisfying those regulatory challenges is becoming quite stifling. And so Europe really hasn't seen the volume that the US has because they're solving for a behemoth of a regulation. I think it was Amit Ganju from Onra Technologies said 2 days ago on stage, it took me 2 years to get certified as a U-Space service provider. And then somebody followed up and said, and how many flights have you supported in U-Space after those 2 years? And he said, 0. So some countries are doing a really good job being flexible and trying to pivot and find creative ways to implement U-Space that provides what the operators are demanding. So Switzerland's a really good example. They've started really working with industry to try and be creative to meet the EASA regulation. But to your point, there are other countries which are much more centralized and much more static, and there isn't a lot of development there, unfortunately.
So from your perspective, what should we do differently as we're trying to roll out these systems and concepts here? People are talking a lot about the great work that's being done in Texas, but really interested from your perspective because you've been working on it so long.
Yeah, so I think what the FAA has done that's been really good is they've taken this iterative approach, right? So industry came to the FAA and they said, we have operator demand. Wing, it was in particular, it was Wing and Zipline were both operating in the North Texas area, and they knew that their volumes were overlapping. And all of the FAA would say at the time is, you guys need to figure out how to not hit each other. And so Wing and Zipline and 4 other companies all got together and said, let's just start doing UTM. There's no certainty from the FAA. There's not a lot of policy or guidance. There's no advisory circular on what to do. So we're just going to do it. We're just going to start doing UTM. And the FAA very quickly said, okay, well, we'd like to get involved in this. We'd like to help work on this together. And so the premise of this new guidance structure and the way that they're setting up governance is it's all based on operator demand. So as the companies come forward and say, our customers need this, FAA, we'd like to work with you on how we're going to implement it, how you reflect this in your regulations. It's been a really effective model. And so the FAA doesn't have to move fast. They don't have the challenge that EASA did of saying, what do we think the picture is going to look like 10 years from now? It's just moving at the pace of industry. FAA hasn't been historically good at that, but they have done a great job working with industry over the last 2 years to have successful rollouts of strategic coordination service. They're about to start turning on network remote identification service. And so for the FAA to turn around a UTM certification in 6 months is pretty record-breaking.
The work that's being done at the FCC on the 5030 to 5091 spectrum, I wonder, and the requirement to use a dynamic frequency management system as part of that, do you see that as being an important part of UTM moving forward, or just a part, or is it relevant at all?
Well, it's of course important for your clients. I think that a lot of the emphasis right now from the UTM companies is that they want to do things strategically and they want to work into automation. So a lot of the decision making for these companies is done before the plane even takes off. That's more of a question of how are we using the internet as opposed to how are we using some of the spectrum.
Well, and I'm curious to know what you both think about what, sort of different buckets of stakeholders should be doing to prepare as we scale up UTM. As, we have a fully formed BVLOS rule. We're sort of adding, layers to the wedding cake, I guess. What do aircraft operators need to do? What do UTM providers need to do? What do, infrastructure owners need to do in this space to start preparing?
From an FCC perspective, I think it would be really useful for the companies that are involved in trying to imagine how UTM can best be done in the United States, to be meeting with the FCC, to be talking about all of the different options they need. And this is, perhaps this is part of the ongoing rulemaking right now where the FCC is seeking comment. I think if the FCC doesn't understand it, then they're going to continue to plow forward with it's kind of a command and control type of structure, which I'm hearing from you isn't really helpful, useful, right? So I think certainly our communications regulators need to understand that, and there needs to be good coordination with the FAA, and they need to be talking with each other more. That has not historically happened, but talking more about how the agencies together can really enable this.
Yeah, so a lot of our clients are very mature companies. They have deep rosters of aviation experts, technology experts, software developers, but all of them are finding out we don't have FCC or communications experts on our team. We've built this great company. None of us are fluent in FCC. And so we're talking about BVLOS. Of course, they're reliant on healthy communications policy in order to scale their business. But all of the companies that I have worked with, they're all finding out, I think we need to hire or we need to go find counsel to tell us about FCC, because that just wasn't in our hiring plan 2 years ago.
And it really is a blind spot. You know, as I said, there was somebody on a panel yesterday that was talking about the use of the 4G and 5G networks to support UAS, and like it really is not authorized. So, you know, when you go to the FAA to get your authorization and you tell them that you're going to use these bands, they say, okay, that's fine, but make sure that you're checking the boxes with the FCC that you have the proper authorities to actually do that. And a lot of people are ignoring that fine print. So, and you can't do it with an experimental, right? So do you have the authority to use that spectrum? And that it's just not a box that anybody is checking. And I think for the moment, it's working, right? There hasn't been the bad impact of the terrestrial network that we're all using for our cell phones being impacted by so many drones flying overhead using the same spectrum that it's interfering with the network. But one day it's going to happen, and Qualcomm did a study a number of years ago, about a decade ago, saying that at density, the drones will impact the terrestrial network. And so there needs to be a way to solve these issues. And that, I mean, I was in the meeting with the FCC when they were first getting a briefing from Qualcomm, and the FCC was really concerned about that, right? And that's why they haven't approved the use, because they haven't figured out these puzzles. So what you don't want to have happen is so much drone use of the commercial wireless systems preventing you from calling 911, right? Like that's like the worst thing that could happen. And I think that's really where the FCC and industry have to solve some problems.
Can I spice it up?
Please.
I've only seen one person fall asleep. So for 8:15, that's pretty good. But we'll try to...
Where is that person?
He or she lifted his head. So I don't see that as being a concern, quite frankly. So the North Texas, Dallas, Fort Worth area is pretty well saturated. The drone delivery companies, the drone as first responders, inspections, you name it. There is a lot of commercial and public drone business in the North Texas area. And there's no darkening of the skies. People are looking up. They rarely see the drone. These missions are quick. They fly fast. You're in and out of somebody's view within 30 seconds. But there is not a darkening of the skies from these drones. It's significant commercial activity for the businesses, but this idea that Qualcomm put forward that you're not going to be able to call 911, I don't see that ever happening.
And this is why the great experience that you're having in Texas needs to be brought to the FCC as a case study, right? To show them that, you know, we're running drones X times per minute or hour, right? And, you know, and get AT&T and whoever else is in that area to say, and we're not seeing any appreciable impact on on the wireless networks.
I think that's a really important point, Jennifer, about how can we bring the real world experience to the regulators? Because I know, having personally been, on the regulator side, not every office or agency operates this way, but you're somewhat siloed, right? I mean, if you're an FAA or an FCC attorney, you get what your program office or line of business brings you. So you're not actually out there seeing, to your point, Matt, you're not actually out there watching these operations. So where there are opportunities to, showcase to these government agencies, like, we're doing this, it's safe, and the sky is not falling, and nothing is falling out of the sky, where there are opportunities to do that, I think, that's a great tool that the industry can use.
For sure. Let's make it happen.
Well, to take like a baby step back in time, I guess, and think a little bit about remote ID and how we fold that into this whole conversation, right, before we, pivot to some of our global considerations. How do you both see, kind of remote ID fitting into this framework here? Do we have, what do you think is the bedrock of UTM, right? Is it the BVLOS rule? Is it remote ID? Is it some combination of both?
I can start. So I touched on this a little bit earlier, but industry organized with oversight from the FAA, this entire governance structure to start implementing and operationalizing UTM services. And they started with strategic deconfliction because it's the most essential one. But these operators all have identified, like, network identification is far superior to broadcast identification, especially as we consider that in the context of the recent release 2209 rulemaking or some of these other security-related measures the government is now coming around to. Network identification offers much more value, both for the operator and for public safety. And so, similar to the way they rolled out strategic deconfliction, industry has just said, we're just going to turn it on. There's nothing that prevents us from offering network identification. We may not get regulatory credit for it, but we're just going to offer it. And the FAA has been involved in these discussions, and they've advised on what a successful rollout would be, even though there is no requirement for it. But my understanding is that this governance structure is going to turn on network identification within the next month.
That makes me so happy. I mean, I was part of the remote ID ARC back in the day, and fought for network ID, and actually we were successful initially, and then the FAA decided to move in the direction of broadcast remote ID, which, for those of us who are really steeped in the technology, we thought that makes no sense. So it's really terrific that we're headed toward network ID, and I will say I saw somebody who I used to do battle with regularly on these issues here earlier this week and mentioned that, and he had total amnesia that he was a big supporter of broadcast ID.
Who was that? But yeah, so to your point, I guess I didn't answer the question the first time, but I think network identification will be your second interoperable service in the recognized UTM space, at least in the United States. And it is one of the services that is required in U-Space over in Europe as well.
That makes sense, and I think that's a good segue to our sort of other region to discuss here, since we are the global UTM and BVLOS integration fireside chat. So it seems like Asia Pacific is doing a lot in this space, right? And they are sort of leaders in using pilot programs and demonstrating national coordination. So I'm curious, Matt, to know kind of how you would characterize approaches from countries like Japan and Singapore and Australia as compared to what we're seeing in the U.S.
Yeah, I think there's just a fundamentally different conversation around UTM happening outside of the U.S. Inside the U.S., the FAA and NASA have always held the position that it's going to be a federated model supported by industry. There are going to be multiple players, multiple actors. It's going to be very dynamic. But that conversation is very different outside of the United States. There's this whole question about, should this be a centralized function? Does this belong more with the ANSP type of service that is offered? Should the government own it? Are there inherently governmental functions about how we're authorizing and distributing airspace access? And that's not resolved. And so the rest of the world is still grappling with this. There's a lot of commercial interest from the private ANSPs in all of these countries that recognize UTM will be a future lucrative business. So in our pre-notes, right, we had Singapore. Singapore is, they're sort of a pioneer for all things airspace in Asia. But Singapore has decided that they're going a centralized model. the government is going to own and operate a certain amount of the functionality of UTM. And so there's just a whole host of different questions, different standards that need to be developed in order to meet where the direction that Singapore is headed. Japan is taking more of the U.S. approach. They seem to be heading in a direction to say the industry federated model is working. How do we develop policies that support that federated model? And then like Australia is still stuck on it. The CAA, the regulator, likes the federated model. Air Services, the ANSP, likes the centralized model, and they've been basically just at a stalemate waiting for somebody to make the decision there. But it's just a completely different question, and that's really interesting. We could do an hour on that another time.
Have you had any experience taking a look at the systems in the Middle East, in the UAE, Dubai?
No, I haven't spent as much time working with those countries, although, I think that they're likely to have very powerful and persuasive ANSPs in those countries. I know that Israel did adopt the use-based regulation. They were flying to Cologne often during the whole use-based deliberations. I think they're taking another look as EASA is going into another round of edits on their use-based regulation. Israel is trying to see, how they might update their regulation accordingly. But for some of the other Middle East countries, I'm not as familiar.
Well, it seems like sort of across the globe, all governments and stakeholders are grappling with very similar issues, right? It's scalability, interoperability, funding, right? I mean, that's a huge consideration too. And then when you start looking at moving away from a federated model like some of these countries are, that opens the Pandora's box of, liability, and we don't have to go into that on this panel. That's a separate panel, maybe for another year. But it sounds like there's certainly, a lot that these CAAs have in common that they're, struggling with here.
I have a question for you. I want to go back to network remote ID, because now I've got some things in my brain that are cycling through. Back in the day when the FAA moved off of network ID and said we want to do broadcast, one of the reasons was the security agencies. The security agencies were really concerned about the fact that they don't control the wireless networks, they don't control the data, like how do they interface with that? So as this group has moved in that direction in Texas, has there been any discussion with the security agencies? Are they concerned at all? Or has that sort of fallen away?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of show and tell with the security communities lately. I think 2 weeks ago, the MAP test site at Virginia Tech hosted a number of DHS officials to come sit down with industry and do a whole demonstration roundtable discussion around network identification. And that didn't really exist before. I remember when the FAA was setting up, it was very short-lived, but the FAA had a Lance-like structure for network ID. And when I was still in the industry, we would get these flashcards with requirements that say, network ID must do this. And we would question the FAA and we would say, why do we have to do it this way? Or what is the benefit? And they said, well, there's some mysterious DHS official telling us this. And we'd say, can you bring them to the meeting? Can we have a conversation and think about more creative ways to solve the problem that the security community has? The industry is not prepared to just hand things over. But that dialogue never happened. It's starting to happen now, which I think is great. I think there's going to be a whole industry shift in how do UTM and data providers interface more often with DHS, but there are also a lot of companies that are going to be quite concerned about privacy and customer data handling.
I mean, that development alone is going to be a major component to the success of getting UTM launched here. That's great to hear.
So when we're thinking about, advising UTM providers on, what they should be doing, right? What do they need to do on Monday? When we all get back to the office. Jennifer, what are the biggest legal risks that you highlight for your UTM clients?
Well, we don't have a durable regulatory structure yet from any of our agencies around this. I think it's great that, this notion that it's a federated approach by private industry, that makes perfect sense. but it does have to have some guardrails by the government, FAA, FCC. So I think understanding that we don't yet have that durable structure is important, and then making sure that we're really actively informing the agencies about the great success that some of these trials are having is necessary.
Yeah, and I would say, right, so our understanding when Joel and I are having conversations with the FAA and with DOT, our understanding is that Part 146 will implement as soon as the regulation is passed or signed. So Part 146 is going to come sooner than Part 108, and so I think that as our firms are going to need to be prepared to advise people on how are we structuring your application, how are you structuring your business to make sure that you are ready to be able to start using these UTM services right away, and for those services that are required, do you have this in your ConOps and your development plan?
Yeah, I think, those are all great points, and I think really synthesize a lot of the things that we've been talking about on other panels too, right? Especially when you fold in kind of the data protection and the privacy angle, right? Those are all things that need to be considered. And also, when we talk about liability, I know, again, it's not the focus of this panel, but, insurance too. And, how does that play in for UTM providers? How does that tie in for, UAS operators? And just sort of thinking more broadly about really stakeholder education across the industry. And I think that, Jennifer, to your point, showcasing all the great things that, all these companies are doing in this space to the government to, really help drive, enabling actions is really important.
Well, you raise an interesting point there. I think it's interesting. We'll see if they do. But the data and the cost, right? So we have a conversation. There's all of this data supporting thousands of flights a day for one operator. So you take a look at the whole NAS, right? We're talking millions of flights. What information does the government need to have, want to have? How much money is it going to cost the government to store that data, to process that data? What are they going to do with it? But the more these security communities say, we'd like to have a full picture of the NAS. We'd like to understand every network ID transaction, which is occurring once every 6 seconds. Like, the cost of that data is going to be monumental, and I'm sure that's something that you guys talk about with your clients a lot.
And what kind of models are people talking about in terms of how that gets paid for?
Well, I think, we can move to our lightning round and then take questions from the audience, which hopefully there are some after this really interesting conversation. Jennifer, what one rulemaking or issue, do you think folks should read really, really closely this year because it's going to have an impact?
You really do need to get deep into the covered list issues for sure. You're not going to be able to fully crack the code on that on your own, so definitely consult with your lawyers about all the foreign UAS and UAS components that are on the covered list, how you get off of it, and then how that relates to equipment authorizations generally, and what you have to do with respect to any modifications you're making to your UAS, and when do you have to go back to the FCC. And truly, the question is, when don't you have to go back to the FCC? So make sure you're consulting with your lawyers on that. And then I would say, the FCC is trying to be part of unleashing drone dominance, right? And they have this open proceeding right now. And so I think important to read the comments that are being filed there and to think about yourself and your companies getting involved and sharing information with the FCC.
Thanks. And Matt, if there's a forum or, a set of standards that you think, folks should be engaging with on sort of the UAS operator and UTM side, what would you recommend people get engaged with?
Yeah, I'm not obligated to say this, but as former president of the Global UTM Association, I would say that GUTMA is doing a really good job at supporting all of the best practices we see around the world, including the stuff we talked about here today in the United States. But GUTMA is convening all of the brightest minds in the UTM space, all of the best ideas, offering that advice back to the CAAs. They're a really important organization that people should be paying attention to.
And then because we have an alphabet soup of aviation acronyms, can you share with our audience what GUTMA is?
Yeah, the Global UTM Association. Yeah.
Great. Well, I think if we have time for questions, Don. I think we have 10 minutes. Okay.
I think Jennifer has a question in the back.
Morning, everybody. My name is Vig Parameshwar. I'm a PhD student at the University of North Dakota. I also did my summer internship with the UAS test site, so I have a little bit of experience with the Part 108 NPRM, and my question is about that. So you talked about the U-Space and the U-Space service providers. I know we have Part 108. It's going to provide guidance on what an ADSP is supposed to do, but I was wondering if you could shed some light on what you saw on the European side that might possibly be adapted for the U.S. market.
Yeah, good question. So what requirements from certification in EASA might pop up in the ADSP construct here? I'd forgotten about that acronym. Thanks for the reminder. My sense is, we talked about it a little bit on stage here, but my sense is that network identification is going to pop up. So the FAA has released these SPSOs that provide a little bit of a template for prospective ADSPs to follow when they're looking for certification for a specific service. There isn't one, and there wasn't a proposed one for network identification. It wasn't considered within the scope of the NUBO NPRM, but it is a required service in EASA member states, and so I would expect that would be the first thing we'll see.
I'm getting flashbacks listening to this panel. As the attorney who had the unenviable task of being on the remote ID role and sitting in those technical interchange meetings, I want to commend you all for doing this outside of the FAA regulatory process. One of the things that really was very frustrating in that process, we got 55,000 comments on the remote ID rule, and 36,000 of them were hating on networked remote ID because the rule was so broad, right? And then we went to the technical interchange meetings, and because we were in active rulemaking and had to be very careful about ex parte, we couldn't talk. So I left there with the complete, utter devotion to industry figuring this out on their own and then coming to us and telling us what we should do. So I'm really looking forward to how 146 gets ultimately implemented. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts. Right now, the rule that was proposed, and I'm not there anymore, so I don't know what will happen, but the rule that was proposed is very broad. It seems to be, come to us and tell us what you're going to do and how you're going to do it and what standard you're going to meet, and then we'll tell you whether or not it's okay. To what extent does that feel like freedom to you, and to what extent does that feel like bring me a rock?
Yeah, I'll start and hand it off to you. I remember working with you on network ID over the years. I think I tried to weasel my way into getting it passed through the counter UAS arc, and you stood up and said absolutely not. But there was a campaign of people hating on network identification back in the day. I would say that I think that maybe that was skewed a bit. But people are really coming around to the benefits of it now, which is great. To answer your question more directly, I think that operators like the freedom, right? So in these other countries other than the United States, there's this framework called SORA, which is Specific Operational Risk Assessment. It essentially says, bring me your ConOps in the way you're going to safely mitigate all of the risk, put it in one package, we will consider it in its totality. And operators love it. It's very different from the way the FAA does things, where we have an airspace, an airman, and an aircraft consideration, because it doesn't allow you to properly weigh the benefits from one segment of your whole operation with the other, right? It's a bit segmented. And so the proposal in this NPRM, which is a little bit more open-ended, I think will provide operators benefit because they can structure their application more in a sort of a more totalistic way.
I absolutely agree with that, Matt. I view it as freedom too, and I think it's I can also no longer speak for the FAA, but I can say that I think it's always a good thing to come to the regulator with an idea, right? And to come to the regulator with a great idea. And I think the sort of the scope and the open-endedness of that piece of the proposed regulation is almost formalizing that, right? Come to us with your idea, we'll tell you what the outcome is. There's some uncertainty there, right? But I think it also gives businesses an opportunity to, present their great idea and to set a precedent there.
Hi, my name is Alexandra Long. I serve as in-house counsel for the University of Colorado Boulder. We use drones a lot in our daily operations and then also to fulfill federally funded research. And I have a nitty-gritty clarification question for you on the FCC regulations. So one of the things that we're currently trying to figure out is what are the limitations and how can we be compliant? And what I'm hearing you say is that the FCC has put out information that says that they, on the jurisdictional piece, nothing that didn't require an FCC authorization now requires an FCC authorization, like the batteries was the example that you used. But what I'm hearing you say now is that the batteries, even though that component itself didn't necessarily need an FCC authorization before, if you are putting a battery that is manufactured by a foreign entity into a UAS that would be otherwise compliant, it could make it not compliant with FCC.
Yeah. I know why you're confused by that. So there are actually two steps. Think about it as two steps. And I'm going to back up before I get into the two steps. If it's a piece of equipment, a component that would not have required an FCC equipment authorization before because it doesn't emit radio frequency, it doesn't need one now. But it's on the covered list. So you have to find a way to get it off the covered list. Otherwise, you can't use it in your UAS, right? So when you're putting together your components for your UAS, if they are foreign and they're on the covered list, you have to find a way off the covered list. That doesn't mean you necessarily have to then also get equipment authorization for that piece if it's not something that emits RF. Does that help? It's about getting off the covered list mostly, but some things also need new equipment authorization look from the FCC. Yeah.
All right. Well, with that, we'll conclude. Thanks so much, everyone. We appreciated your questions, appreciated the panelists and our fireside chat format. I'll hand it back over to Don.
All right, thank you so much. Let's give them a rousing round of applause here for pivoting in a big way.